Assalamu alaikum, Mr. Zainab. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam wa barakatuh. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Alhamdulillah, I'm glad to be here.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So I believe there are about 55 attendees. So inshallah, we can just give them a minute. In the meantime, I just wanted to introduce you to the class and tell them a little bit about you. So Ustad Zainab, she is a resident scholar at Taysir Seminary, and what makes her truly unique is that she's one of the few Muslim women who are in this space, and she obtained her classical or traditional Islamic study in Syria, amongst other places, and she studied areas such as Quran, Islamic law, theology, and spirituality, amongst other things. Inshallah, through this experience of tonight and as well as next Sunday, we'll be learning about the history of how Muslims came through to America through the Atlantic slave trade as well as other mechanisms. So thank you so much for joining us, and inshallah, this will be a fruitful evening and a fruitful class as a whole.
Thank you for that introduction. And let's go ahead and start the video here. All right. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. So happy to see everybody. And thank you, Brother Hussam, for introducing me. And I just want to acknowledge Brother Hussam and the work of the Al-Hidaya Center team putting this class together. Super excited about our plan for this evening, inshallah ta'ala. So we are going to have two classes, obviously beginning tonight, and then inshallah picking back up next weekend. So this is really kind of designed to be about 4 hours of kind of a combination of lecture, of discussion, Q&A, and reflections, hopefully, on the subject matter. So again, really happy to welcome everybody. And I will, inshallah, we'll begin properly, then I'll share my screen in just a moment. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa taslima. Alhamdulillah. Very happy to, again, welcome everybody. So a couple things that I'm going to need to just kind of housekeeping. I'm aware that we are pretty close to Maghrib time. So I just wanted to ask our host, Brother Hussam, about that in terms of kind of a little break for Maghrib. So what would you suggest? Because I believe that our participants are probably logging on from multiple locations, but we probably have a number of people for whom Maghrib is approaching. So what is your suggestion there?
So I believe for those who are based in New York, Maghrib was at 5:30. So
Oh,
we
okay.
had a chance to pray before the class. Um, I think maybe we can take 5 minutes, at the top of the hour, maybe at 7, just in case anyone's joining us from other areas. And if people have already prayed, they can just maybe submit any questions or raise their hand to submit any Q&A during that time.
Okay, excellent. So I'm just checking on the prayer calendar. I think that works. This is yes, so this is Sunday the 20th. Maghrib does come in. Well, Maghrib does come in at 6:23 my time, inshallah. So would it be okay if I stepped away around 6:40?
Yeah, that also works. That's fine.
Okay, just to be mindful of the fact that Maghrib is going to be coming in again, my time is 6:23. So about, in about 15 minutes or so. So inshallah, I will have to step away around 6:40 for a few minutes just
Sure.
to make sure that I do that. Okay, so just wanted to give everybody that heads up that that's what we'll be doing, inshallah ta'ala. So if you'll just bear with me, I'll be sharing my screen in just a moment, but I also have another device here in front of me for my notes as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And I have a presentation that I prepared for you. And this presentation, let me actually go back to the beginning here. So this presentation is a joint effort, and it originated with, and I want to make sure that we give credit to the person who first put this together. So the person who originated the presentation is Dr. Amar Farouk Abdullah. So he taught a class on Islam in America some years back for his students at Nawawi Foundation. So this Islam in America presentation that you see here with Dr. Amar's name on it became kind of the basis for Islam in America presentations that were offered by the Islamic Networks Group. And that is the group based in California that trained speakers bureaus all over the country to present on issues relating to Islam and Muslims. So that was the presentation that I originally trained on. And then subsequent to that, I've been teaching classes on Islam in America for several years now at Taysir Seminary in Knoxville. So I just wanted to give you that background and make sure we give credit to where credit is due. And since I first was introduced to this presentation, trained on it, I've done some updates, and my students from Taysir Seminary class of 22, as you can see here, have been super helpful in updating some of the content. So I just want to make sure to acknowledge my students who worked on this: Sister Samra Iqbal, Sister Sabriya Shah, Sister Maimuna Abdul Rahman, Brother Nasir Muhammad, Brother Ibrahim Khan, and Sister Noura Huda Nuruddin. So what I'm going to do before I actually advance the slides, because I understand that, we're going to be webinar style tonight, which means that I, of course, will have camera and microphone access. But for our participants, we are going to encourage you to post your questions and comments. Well, there are a couple options here. So there is the chat box, and there's also a Q&A box. So inshallah, if it's okay with our host, Brother Hassam, I think I'd like to actually utilize that Q&A. The Q&A option will actually allow us to see which questions are pending, which have been answered, and so on.
Yes,
Inshallah,
you can definitely
yes.
do that. And also, if you wanted to utilize the raising the hand function and allowing them to speak, that's fine too.
Absolutely. So, so you heard Brother Hassam, you're also welcome to raise your hand, and we can, have your microphone connected. Inshallah, in terms of, since I want to kind of jump right into the material, and since I have the Maghrib break, I wanted to do a quiz. I think I might actually wait until next week to actually do a pop quiz. This is on Kahoot, so I'm not quite sure how it'll work, because with Kahoot, I normally do that in person. And what you would be doing is I would give you a pin, you would go to the Kahoot website, and you would load the quiz and try to take it. But it might be a fun activity we can do next time, inshallah ta'ala. But just to kind of, since we can't do introductions or an icebreaker, I'd love to do that, but I know that would take a good portion of the class. And I'm sure you want to get right into the material. Let me ask you actually three kind of quick kind of pop questions just to get us started. And you can go ahead and put those answers in the chat box. So who would you say is the most famous American Muslim is my first question. And I think this is so that's a fairly easy question to answer. Absolutely. So Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X are the responses that, yes, yeah. And I think Muhammad Ali apparently is one of the most famous Americans, period, and several polls done all over the world. Absolutely. The next question that I have for you, can you name the person who was instrumental in making sure that Malcolm X performed his Hajj? Who was that person? The person who was instrumental in making sure that Malcolm performed his Hajj. Okay, alhamdulillah. So I'm trying to gauge the responses. I like the no idea response because I want to make sure that I'm going to be conveying some new material. Okay, so Sister Betty Shabazz, no. So Sister Betty Shabazz was certainly supportive of his Hajj pilgrimage. Absolutely. Sister Betty was his wife, Allah yarhamha. His mother, no, his mother had a very, his mother had, I'm not sure if his mother was actually alive when he made his Hajj. I'll have to double check and look into that, because after Malcolm X, after the father of Malcolm X was murdered by white supremacists, the family was broken up. His mother ended up being institutionalized. It was very tragic. So no, it wasn't his mother. That last response, I'm not really quite sure how to respond to that, so we'll keep it moving. No, it was actually Sister Ella Collins. One of the things I want you all to understand here, when I teach classes on Islam in America, I really try to bring women's experiences to the fore, because, I think one of the perhaps liabilities of sort of a great man theory of history, where we kind of assume that everything that's kind of exciting in history is because of the unique genius of kind of a charismatic male leader, that in that great man theory of history, what's happening is the roles of women are going to be subsumed. So I want you to remember that name. Sister Ella Collins was actually one of the first teachers of Malcolm X, and she was the one who actually used her own resources to make sure he was able to take that Hajj pilgrimage, which ended up being an incredibly transformative moment. And by the way, tomorrow does mark the 57th anniversary of the martyrdom of Al-Hajj Malcolm X. Allah yarhamu, may Allah have mercy on him and grant him Jannah. Ameen. So that was 1, 2. Okay, so now my third question for you is name one significant Muslim figure during the antebellum period of American history. One significant Muslim figure during the antebellum period of American history. All right, don't see any responses yet. So that's why we're teaching this class, right? Yes, absolutely. And that is why we are teaching this class. Number one, what is the antebellum period? And number two, were there Muslims at that time, and what were they doing? What was the significance of their stories? Abdurrahman Ibrahima is one person that maybe Brother Keith, you're referring to Abdurrahman Ibrahima, and there's a documentary about his life. Okay, good. Now I am going to actually start after my introduction with the end of this presentation first. I kind of want to bring us into the present moment. Then we are going to look at the past, and then inshallah come full circle next week, thinking about ways we can move forward as a community. Before I forget, we do have, in addition to coming to class and participating, I will leave it up to Brother Hissam in case there are any additional requirements for Al-Hidaya students. Al-Hidaya has an Islamic seminary, mashallah, full-time program. So if there are any seminarians here and you are taking this class for credit, make sure you check with Brother Hassan to see what requirements there are. I believe that we are asking for a brief reflection of about 250 to 300 words total. So 150 words per class. You will receive the link where you could submit that reflection at the end of class. I think it'll be posted in the chat, as well as sent in an email to you. And this just helps us to kind of get your reflections and helps us to improve this class. Now, we want to, so again, in terms of the why, so why are we all here? So obviously you read the course description that was sent out, but in kind of thinking about why I'm putting this course together, why is this interesting? You know, for either there are some people that actually shy away from studying history, not really understanding its relevance. The idea that this kind of happened in the past, why is it of concern to me today? I can give you examples of Masajid, for example, doing events during Black History Month and bringing in speakers, and people in the congregation will say, why do I need to learn this? So the fact that you all are here obviously means that there is interest in the topic, but these are 3 points that I want to bring together to introduce you to this class in terms of the why of this. Number one is, we'll actually start with Brother Malik Shah here, this point here at the bottom. And Brother Malik Shah is the executive director of MANA, the Muslim Alliance in North America, an organization that was founded by Imam Siraj Wahhaj. Brother Malik is also the co-founder of the Midtown Mosque in Memphis, and he is involved in community revitalization projects in Memphis, in the inner city. And he came to our community this past weekend and gave a talk on the African American mosque. And as we were discussing the American Muslim religious landscape, looking at the masjid as institution and the demographics of that institution, he noted quite aptly, and I think very apropos for our course tonight, why study the history of African Americans, and why do we care about this history and patterns of conversion in African American Muslims today? Because according to Brother Malik, and this is very important for transnational and immigrant Muslims, that African Americans are the canary in the coal mine, is the point that he made. In other words, what is impacting the African American community and the Muslim community is surely going to impact the rest of us. The second point that I want to share is kind of moving up, is Dr. Sherman Jackson's Banu Hashim thesis. And let me see if somebody actually wants to comment on that. Do I have anybody who could actually summarize what is hopefully you've heard of Dr. Sherman Jackson, but what is his Banu Hashim thesis? Do I have any volunteers? All right, so Dr. Sherman Jackson wrote a classic book on Islam in America, Islam and the Black American, looking toward the third resurrection. I was just actually seeing if I have it in my library here. It's probably here. I'll grab it in just a second. So in 2005, he writes this classic book, again, Islam and the Black American, looking toward the third resurrection. And in this book, he presents his Banu Hashim thesis. His book, Islam and the Black American, is as much a message to immigrant and transnational Muslims as it is to the African American community. And one of the very salient points that Dr. Jackson makes in that book is he gives us the analogy of the seerah of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And he's going to draw parallels. One of the main parallels that he draws is the idea that Islam in Mecca is going to be preserved because of the Banu Hashim around the Prophet ﷺ. Think about it, right? Mecca is, as you all know from studying prophetic biography, early Islamic history, Mecca is an incredibly hostile environment to monotheism. The Prophet's life is threatened on multiple occasions. We know that one of the main reasons that the Prophet, peace upon him, is able to actually continue with his mission in the way that he does is because of the support of his non-Muslim kinsmen and family around him. Remember, when we look at Banu Hashim and Banu Muttalib, those were the two main clans of Quraysh that were, of course, directly related to the Prophet, that he came from Banu Hashim, alayhi salatu wasalam. The vast majority of them are not Muslim. I want you all to understand this. And according to Dr. Jackson's thesis, it is the support of the non-Muslims of Banu Hashim that actually afford the Prophet, peace upon him, a certain degree of protection. That's why the Quraysh sanction Banu Hashim and Banu Muttalib. During the boycott, they impose not just on the Muslims, but the non-Muslims who support them. Dr. Jackson argues in his book, Islam and the Black American, that it would have been laudable, and it would have been something that would have sort of redounded to the benefit of the immigrant Muslim community if that community had recognized African Americans as the equivalent to Banu Hashim, right? As their Banu Hashim in the United States, in North America. Now, Dr. Jackson has concluded that because the immigrant community overall was not able to embrace the African American community as their Banu Hashim, that there was an opportunity that was lost. Although I think Brother Malik, when we kind of discussed that the other day, he felt that there was perhaps still a small window where the immigrant transnational American Muslim community could still look at the African American Muslim experience, not just to draw lessons, but to also form alliances and to benefit both communities. So I want to introduce you to that, this idea of the Banu Hashim thesis. The second or the third point is Imam Muhammad Adiyanka Mendes, who teaches for Celebrate Mercy, has just released a book on called The Spirits of Black Folk. Let me see if I've actually got the book here. I have so many books in my library, subhanAllah. Yeah, I get books and I put them away, but inshallah, if you bear with me, I might be able to actually find the book for you in just a second. But this book is called it's called The Spirits of Black Folk. It's a play on the book by W.E.B. Du Bois, the Souls of Black Folk, which I actually have right here. And okay, here we are. So here's Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk. I'll probably be coming back to this. So Imam Muhammad has a book called, again, The Spirits of Black Folk. And what he does, he writes about Islam and Blackness. What he's doing in that book is he's looking at pre-modern scholars like Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, who actually wrote a book called Rafi' Sha'n al-Hubshan, Rafi'u Sha'n al-Hubshan, or elevating the sort of the place and the concerns of al-Hubshan, people of African descent. So it's a remarkable book that Imam Muhammad has authored. It just came out. He taught it for Celebrate Mercy over the last couple of weeks. And one of the things that Imam Muhammad noted in his presentation in terms of the why, like why write about this? Why write about Blackness in Islam? Why write about Black companions? Why teach a course called Black Lives Around the Messenger? Because people actually say, why do we need to do this? And his response to this was the following. He said this in a very, it was so succinct and it really stayed with me, that African Americans are the unique kind of singular group in America that's come to Islam in droves. And that really ties into the Banu Hashim thesis, right? Where else do we see that type of kind of like singular pattern of conversion where you have one group that is just so incredibly receptive to Islam, especially in this Western context? We need to pay more attention to this, and let me go ahead and I'm going to minimize this for a second because I want to switch to some other things to share with you all real fast. We need to think about the fact that when you look historically at how Islam has spread in traditional areas of the Muslim world, that often those patterns of conversion are going to be accompanied by sort of larger political developments, military developments, and so on. In some cases, you're going to have situations where Islam is kind of appealing to maybe some of the elite members of society. In other words, there are different patterns of Islamicization in various societies, but ultimately what's going to happen, when these lands are open to Islam, and again, this is early Islamic history, is that these patterns of conversion are going to be accompanied by a certain degree of political and military activity, i.e. the Muslims are viewed as the dominant force and a Muslim polity is being established. That's not happening in the Western context. It is a very different context. This is a group of people that's oppressed, that's marginalized, that they are coming to Islam. So when you look at sort of the history conversion to Islam overall, there's something quite unique about patterns of conversion in America. I remember a teacher of mine in Syria many years ago kind of asking about Islam in America and who becomes Muslim. Why doesn't kind of Islam sort of take hold in the way that it does in more traditional areas? So why doesn't Islam kind of take hold the way it does in more traditional areas of the Muslim world? Well, in order to understand that, you have to look at this unique context and what we are going to be examining now, which is the Atlantic world, a world that is really kind of produced in those encounters between old world and new world peoples, ideas, and commodities, of course, and religions. So that is my introduction. That is my adhan for Maghrib, but we're going to go on for another 15 minutes because there's a lot of material that I want to cover. And I just want to make sure that I have not missed any questions. Let me know if there are any questions or comments, anything that I need to come back to. In the meantime, let me go ahead and actually share the document for this course. Just give me one moment. Okay, and I want you to kind of see sort of at a glance what we are going to be doing inshallah this evening and over next week. Okay, let's see here. Bismillah. So inshallah ta'ala, these are the broad topics that I plan on uncovering. We're going to be looking at, in just a moment, inshallah, at the Atlantic world. I'll be kind of unpacking what that means, why it's important in the context of world history, looking at the transatlantic slave trade, looking at theories of pre-Columbian contact, and Muslims in the antebellum South. That's going to primarily be my focus for tonight, although some of that obviously will kind of be addressed next week as well. And then next week, I want to kind of look at early to mid 20th century history, and kind of think about bringing that full circle in terms of where we are today. So that's the plan. There are a number of resources that I shared with you. So here are the required readings. Here are some supplemental resources as well. And I'm going to just very quickly, inshallah, I'm just going to very quickly kind of open these links. So just so I can kind of walk everybody through what I would like you to be reading and kind of viewing, just to kind of help to round out this experience. So this is, as you can see, a documentary feature by Ava DuVernay, and she looks at the idea of the 13th Amendment. And keep in mind that, let's do some quick US history here. Keep in mind that the Constitution, while being a very brilliant document on many levels, is a document that really kind of has certain contradictions embedded in it. The number one contradiction is that you have a group of people that are writing about ideas such as sort of freedom and liberty, and self-determination and equality and sort of independence and so on, while at the same time literally owning human beings. So I want you to take a look at this documentary, The 13th, which looks at sort of the idea of slavery not kind of ending with the 13th Amendment, but how slavery has really kind of been reproduced and continued in new in many iterations since the earliest history of this country. There were three key amendments that were passed to the Constitution in the 19th century. This is really kind of during the era of the Civil War. What is the antebellum period? The antebellum period is the era of American history basically before the Civil War. That's what we call the antebellum period. And Sister Mary, often you will hear the word antebellum used in the context of the antebellum South. For a lot of people, it is a picture of the Deep South that's been romanticized. Plantations, women in beautiful dresses, and happy Negroes working the fields. That is a stereotype. And that is something that we are going to unpack in this class. All right. Maybe you've heard of the film Gone with the Wind, which was a film that attempted to sort of whitewash and sort of romanticize an era of history that was anything but romantic. All right, so again, antebellum is before the Civil War. After the Civil War, we will call that the postbellum or Reconstruction period. So I hope that answers the question. So take a look at this documentary, and please keep in mind, you don't want to watch this with the kids necessarily. This is something that is for a mature audience. Other resources, again, like I said, the Constitution is a brilliant document, but it has several glaring contradictions embedded in it. And the New York Times put out an incredible piece of analysis a few years back. This was the 1619 project that commemorated in 2019, that commemorated the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Africans to these shores. It's a project that was spearheaded by the amazing journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who maybe you've heard some interviews with her. She was in the news because she actually had her tenure, I think, at UNC Chapel Hill. She had her tenure rejected because someone kind of objected to the work that she did on this project. And I believe she's now at Howard University. But I really want, to draw your attention to this important resource. In this piece, she argues that we have to really, that the history of the founding of the United States is every bit as much a history of the Africans that come to these shores and the Africans that really kind of build what becomes the foundation of this sort of global superpower, as much as America owes its founding to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It's a project that raised the ire of the previous president, I have to say, who attempted to politicize it. And there have been efforts recently, if you've obviously been following the headlines, efforts to ban critical race theory, efforts to actually ban the teaching of the 1619 Project in American classrooms. Why? Because this type of history is painful. There are a lot of folks who don't want to grapple with the fact that the enslavement of human beings is one of the foundations of this country. All right. Yes, this country was founded for many reasons. Religious freedom was certainly one of them. Separation from the, from the English crown was another reason. But also what Nicole Hannah-Jones argues is that slavery and the desire to keep Africans enslaved was never very far from early American history and the founding fathers. Another resource that I want to mention, let me see. So we've looked at, 13th. Is this article right here. Like I said, I'm kind of doing, with this class, it's not going to be solely a class on history. I also want us to think about the present, which is why I brought those quotes from the different imams and scholars regarding African Americans today as kind of the canary in the coal mine, and why we should be paying attention to the African American community and the ongoing struggle for dignity, for freedom, for human rights. So make sure you take a look at this piece from Yaqeen Institute, Being Black and Muslim in America, a study on identity and well-being. So they give us a nice little kind of overview of Black American Muslim history. And then the rest of the article is going to focus again on African American Muslims today, again, in terms of identification, in terms of well-being, in terms of challenges that the community is experiencing. Other resources here, Prince Among Slaves. I wish we had time to watch the trailer. Inshallah, who knows? Maybe we might be able to do that in a couple of minutes. We'll see. But this is a film that came out some years back that focuses on the life of Abdurrahman Ibrahima, who came from kind of a princely background in West Africa and ends up enslaved in Mississippi. And then the other pieces that I assigned, so I was looking for a good overview because again, there's a lot of content that I'm going to teach. I know that not everybody has time to read full-length books on the topic. So I was trying to find scholarship by non-Muslims, by the way, because I want to kind of round out what I'm presenting. I wanted to find scholarship by both Muslims and non-Muslims. So this is an article, Muslims of Early America, noting how Muslims came to America more than a century before Protestants and in greater numbers or in great numbers, and how and why really was this history forgotten? Again, why is there such an erasure? You know, most Americans will tell you they've never heard this kind of history, not in middle school, not in high school, even in college, unless people actually go and kind of seek out these narratives. Then there was an amazing piece in the Atlantic magazine on Estebanico, who was probably originally from Morocco. We'll talk about Estebanico in just a moment. Black America's Neglected Origin Stories by Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed. Make sure you take a look at this. Other resources, yes, Dr. Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick, who's written a book on Muslims in the Americas. Here's an article here, The African and Muslim Discovery of America Before Columbus. I wanted to introduce you to this idea of pre-Columbian contact. All right, any questions or comments before we continue? Again, one of the things I do when I teach is I always want to make sure that I introduce my students to resources to help them have a fuller understanding of the material. Questions, comments, just let me know. All right, so if there are no further questions, yes, can we get the links to the resources, please? Absolutely. I will put the links, inshallah, or actually, Brother Hassam, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, inshallah. I'm trying to see if would it be possible for you to put these links? I'm not sure if you're able to see what I've just shared. Would that be feasible to put some of those links? Or if I send them
So
to you,
maybe,
perhaps,
yeah.
if I send them to you, would that be helpful?
Yeah, that can work. And also, actually, what you can do is you can put them in the chat, and
Okay.
I'll compile them in an email and send them to them.
Okay, perfect. And we'll do that, inshallah. I will put them. Okay. So I'm going to start kind of putting these links here in the chat, and they'll also go out. They'll also go out in an email. Yes, those links were actually some of them were sent out in an email, but there are others that I am mentioning tonight that were not in that email. So let me just go and quickly do a copy and paste, at least for some of those, and then inshallah we are going to continue on. So like I said, my intention was to really kind of start in this present moment and go back. So let me do that. So here are the top three. Okay, there's the Atlantic piece. There's the piece on Muslims before Protestants. And then there's the piece by Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick. So go ahead and take a look at those. Those are the ones Brother Hassan has already sent out, by the way. And inshallah, we'll share the additional links in just a moment. But we have to kind of keep everything moving. So let's go ahead and do this. Here's something that really, I think my main kind of inspiration for this class was something I'm going to show you all right now. You know, I think most of us probably have a pretty good sense of, you know, kind of where is our community today. I actually want to start with that piece. The reason I want to start with that piece is I want you to think about the fact that through the span, kind of through the passage of time, when we kind of look at the history of Islam in America, for the longest, my contention is that Islam in this country very much had sort of an African profile. It was something that was really kind of connected very closely to people that are people that are, in a sense, indigenous to this land, people that helped to build this country. But there's a shift that's going to take place. That shift takes place probably in, I want to argue, probably the 1970s, 1980s. We really kind of begin to see a shift away from what is very much a sort of what is very much sort of a Black profile of Islam in America to one that's very different, to where Islam is seen as something that is kind of foreign, sort of other, not really not really kind of connected to the American experience, the American story. Why does that happen? And I think that the answers actually lie in kind of looking at the picture, kind of the picture of the community today, as well as kind of going back in time and doing some investigation. So let's actually begin with what is the face of Islam in America today. And what experts will tell you is that while the community is incredibly diverse, that kind of rich African American profile of Islam in America is something that is being kind of erased. And we need to consider why that's the case. So let's go ahead and take a look at. Actually, I'm going to show you the immigration slide first. So just bear with me as I scroll back up. So here we are, waves of immigration. So there are, according to Dr. Amar, there are about 5 kind of, we can kind of think about patterns of immigration to the United States in terms of these waves of immigration. But what I want you to understand here is there's something that happens before our first wave, right? We're talking about voluntary, by the way, this is voluntary immigration. Before you even get that first wave, we have to think about the Atlantic slave trade. And before that, we need to think about theories of pre-Columbian contact. And what I'm going to argue is that from from possible contact between the Old World and New World before Christopher Columbus, through the Atlantic slave trade, well into that 4th wave. So the first wave, second wave, third wave, fourth wave that kind of bring in people from the Holy Land, i.e. from the Ottoman territories, etc. Once you even getting into that 4th wave of immigration from the Muslim world, Islam in America still very much has this sort of Black American profile, but something is going to kind of start to change post that 5th wave, to where the African Americans as a demographic are going to represent a kind of smaller percentage overall of the American Muslim population. And as I said, this process of othering takes place, where Islam is going to be seen as something kind of new, foreign, alien, other, kind of newly imported to these shores. So that's the immigration piece. Let me kind of come back to these slides I wanted to share with you, okay? So here we have, again, Muslim immigration since 1965. This is when we get quotas. So where before the US government had imposed quotas on immigration from the Muslim world, in 1965, an important piece of legislation is passed called the Hart-Celler Act, which boosts immigration from the Muslim world. And this brings in a lot of people that are students or people that are already highly educated that are going to contribute to, obviously, to society. They're going to be, in a sense, really the model kind of immigrants that we kind of often, hear about. So think about this, because for a lot of American Muslims today, especially if you have immigrant or transnational roots, for a lot of folks, your origin story might actually go back to this wave that comes in, kind of 5th wave after that, kind of post 1965, when you have people coming into the United States who are going to set up the MSA and ISNA and ICNA and some major organizations after that. All right, so what is the overall number of American Muslims today? We don't have accurate figures about that. So there, in terms of where you might actually get this information, probably ISPU has the best information. That's the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ispu.org. But the reason why we don't have exact numbers, and I'll tell you, some years back when I first started to train on the history of Islam in America, and we were doing presentations on the demographics, the number that was cited was I think 7 to 10 million, until scholars revised that, realizing that number probably represents a very optimistic kind of overestimation of the American Muslim population. So it is believed that this kind of this 3.5 million or thereabouts is probably a more accurate figure. And again, the reason why we don't have an exact projection of this is because the US Census does not ask for religious affiliation. So that's why the numbers really are estimates based upon demographics in major urban centers, based upon mosque attendance and surveys and so on. So I just wanted to give you all that background in terms of how the community looks today. It is a very diverse community. These are some photos. My students updated the photos. I wanted kind of a more accurate representation of where the community is today, who are some of the recognizable faces. So these are the people that they chose, and alhamdulillah. So we've got Dr. Rani Awad in California, who runs the Muslim Mental Health Lab in Stanford. Of course, Muhammad Ali, that a number of you mentioned as being the most famous American Muslim. We have Sister Halima Aden, who gained fame as the one of the as the first supermodel in hijab to grace the covers of various magazines. Although her journey, I think, has taken a different direction as she kind of left some of that modeling. And then we have, Hassan Minhaj from the Daily Show, who was on the Daily Show, who has, who's a stand-up comic. Again, keep in mind that, when we worked on this presentation, that we're not necessarily looking at people from the standpoint of aqidah and how correct is their aqidah and so on. I always say that to any audience. If you are seeking to study the history of Islam in America through the lens of aqidah, you won't get very far, because you're going to find that there are a lot of people that are self-identified Muslims. This is a term that sociologists use, that people are self-identifying with the community. So when people self-identify as Muslims, they may or may not hold beliefs that are kind of that adhere to orthodox Muslim requirements. And I want you all to keep that in mind. Let's see. In terms of public service, we have people like, let's see, we have Sister Saliha Jabin, first Muslim female Air Force chaplain. This is a recent photo. We have Medina Wilson Anton in Delaware as a state representative. We have Keith Ellison, who was the first Muslim elected to Congress. This is in 2006. Currently, he's the AG, Attorney General of Minnesota. And we have Ali Zaidi, who's a Pakistani American lawyer and a political advisor, and he serves as a national climate advisor under the current administration. So this is just a quick kind of snapshot. So alhamdulillah, this is still a strength, despite the fact that the African-American profile has receded. It is still a very diverse community. And in terms of the community today, this number, so about 58%, it's still a very significant immigrant population, that component. 58% first generation immigrants, representing 75 different countries of origin, the largest first generation group being South Asians at 35%. Conversion's interesting right here. So conversion, one of the things that we are finding, that scholars are finding today, is that conversion is receding. We are not seeing the robust levels of conversion to Islam that we saw perhaps in the 80s and 90s. And this is something we need to keep in mind, because if we are not seeing, those robust patterns of conversion, that will certainly impact both the current profile as well as future of Islam in America. This is the estimate of the number of mosques we have in America today. And well, this is interesting. I need to study this further. According to my students, the third largest religious group in the US, we are currently at third, estimated to become the second, potentially by 2050, due to immigration. And generally that Muslim families tend to have larger family sizes. All right, this was interesting to me. So let's take a look at this. The ethnic makeup, and this is recent data, as you can see, ethnic makeup of Muslim Americans today. And you're seeing how Muslim Americans are going to self-identify with 20 still. So that's a still significant percentage of the population, with Black or African American Muslims identifying, per this particular survey, at being about 28% of respondents, Asians at 23%, white at 19%, Arab at 14%, and you see the other numbers, Hispanic, Native American, and others. So what I want to point out to you about this category, and I would really have to bring an earlier version of the presentation, is that these numbers have shifted quite a bit. For example, Muslims identifying as white is an interesting category, and I would really need to actually read the survey data and look at their methodology to understand this better, because for the longest, that category, the kind of the MENA category, Middle Eastern North African, was largely subsumed under white, i.e. that if you were, if there were respondents from the Middle East or North Africa, say you have people from Morocco or people from Egypt, people from Turkey, people from Iran, a lot of them were self-identifying as white. They were responding to, whether they were responding to the census or other kind of surveys. So I want you all to keep in mind that this is a fairly new development to actually kind of separate out these brackets where you have a category for Arabs and then another category for white. So I think that kind of bears some investigation there. Also, that let's go back to this, that 28%. Remember, at one point, the category for the percentage that identifies as Black was probably upwards of 35-40% at one point. We are still the most ethnically diverse religious group in the, which is an incredible strength of our community, although I don't know if we're really kind of hard that as a strength. Where do Muslims live today? As you can imagine, Muslims are largely concentrated in these major urban centers, okay? With quite a few of them obviously being in the along the eastern seaboard, or or in the northeast Midwest or so. Family values, all right. This is really quite interesting. Although ISPU, generally American Muslims are an affluent population, except ISPU has found there's been a pretty serious impact of COVID-19 on the American Muslim population in terms of income and earnings, and especially kind of affecting Arab Muslims in particular is what they are finding. And participation in American life, Muslims are quite active. And this is very interesting to me, that frequent mosque attendance is linked to greater engagement as opposed to less engagement. There is the assumption that somehow people who did not strongly identify as Muslim would be more active, but it's actually kind of the reverse of that. People who strongly identify with the masjid institution tend to be kind of more engaged. All right, we'll kind of skip that. And let's kind of go to the one that really caught my attention, which is this one. This is, again, back to this idea of how the profile of Muslims in America has changed. This is the one that is the most alarming. Like, this is the canary in the coal mine piece, which is how the percentage of African-American mosques have declined. So this is based upon the mosque report led by Dr. Ihsan Bagby. You can see his picture there in the top right-hand corner of the screen. I attended the webinar. I think this is back in December. So Dr. Bagby has been studying the American mosque for decades. There was a report that came out, I think, in 2000, then another one in 2010, then another one in 2020. So basically, it is something that they do every decade. And what he has found is that while the numbers of mosques have grown, while congregations are fairly diverse, while women have made strides in masajid, while Muslims are more politically active and aware, what he's finding is that the percentage of African American mosques overall has declined. And you can see those stats right there. All right. So where 27% of mosques studied in 2000 were African American, only 23% in 2010. And look how that number rather precipitously declined to where only 13% of all mosques today are African American. And this is quite startling in light of the history that we're going to be studying, inshallah, in just a moment. There are several factors for this, and inshallah, I hope to come back to that. So with that, inshallah, I'm going to step away and pray Maghrib, but I'd love to see if there are any questions, comments, or reactions to this information before we, again, like I said, we're in the present moment. Now we need to go back to the past. So any questions or comments, just let me know. Bismillah. Okay, if there aren't any questions or comments, then inshallah, I am going to just go ahead and inshallah, just step away for a few minutes. So just bear with me. So please use this time to take a break if you wish, or look at some of the readings that were shared here in the chat. And inshallah ta'ala, I will see everybody in just a moment. Again, bear with me, but I don't want to miss my maghrib. That just would not be cool. So I'll be right back, inshallah ta'ala. All right, thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So in the meantime, I just wanted to quickly review something with all of you. So once again, this course is being offered as part of the Al-Hidaya Seminary, which is an adult certification program. It is counting as a seminar course, which is almost one of the shorter electives in addition to the full-time classes. And in order to receive credit for this class, you will just be required to submit 2 reflections. So the first one is going to be after this first class, and the length is around 150 words. And same thing for next week, just a reflection of 150 words. What I will do now is I will be sharing the link in the chat as well as in an email after the class for where you can submit your reflections. Be sure to prepare them nicely. They will be shared with Ustad Zainab, and she'll be looking thoroughly through them. Thank you so much for your time, and inshallah, hope to see the rest of the class soon.
Assalamu alaikum. Let's go ahead and resume. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All right, everybody still with me? Okay, so we are going to resume and inshallah, let me share my screen. And I want to look at, I've been talking a lot about this idea of the Atlantic world and theories of pre-Columbian contact. So let's go ahead and take a look at those slides so you can see what I'm talking about. So how old really is the Muslim presence in America? There is a very tantalizing theory about this. This is the theory of pre-Columbian contact. Now, before I actually present the theory, I want everyone to understand why this theory is important and why, by the way, it's largely overlooked or dismissed by conventional scholars, conventional historians. For the vast majority of scholars, if you were to ask them about the quote unquote discovery of the New World, they would, of course, cite Christopher Columbus as being, and other European navigators and explorers as being, again, sort of principally responsible for the discovery of the New World and this new Atlantic world that is created, like I said, in the encounters between old and new world peoples. The idea, this idea of sort of pre-Columbian theories of contact, it really kind of upends conventional historical narrative.
Assalamu alaikum, Mustada. I believe your sound just cut off for a moment.
I was muted. Are you all able to hear me? Just let me know.
I can hear you now.
Okay, sound is good. Okay. So
Also, Mustada, no, it looks like it cut off again. It might be your noise suppression.
okay, just give me 1 second, inshallah. Let me look into this. All right, let's see. Assalamu alaikum. My apologies. Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay.
Also, I believe there are just a couple questions in the Q&A.
Yes, I'm sorry. So okay, how's that? Are we okay?
It's a little bit muffled. It's not as clear as it was before.
Sorry, we're having some trouble with the audio. Just give me 1 moment. I'm trying to figure out what's going on with this. All right, is that better? No, let's see. Okay, is that better?
Yes, much better.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm having an issue where the volume, the output, and input from this device are defaulting to my daughter's AirPods. I have no idea what's going on. So I just asked for the AirPods and hopefully this works for now. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So please forgive me for that. Again, one of the liabilities of technology. So there are a couple of questions. Let's go ahead and take a look at those. When we talk about Muslims in a population in the US, does this include the NOI? I'd have to look into that. I mean, in terms of the current, yes, from what I understand, if the in terms of the methodology employed in these surveys conducted by ISPU and other organizations, I don't believe they are asking questions about people's aqidah. Like I said, we have to really put the issue of aqidah aside for now, because when I teach about the history of Islam in America, not that it's important, of course it's important, but the point is that we're looking at groups that self-identify as Muslim. There are going to be groups, what Dr. Sherman Jackson calls proto-Islamic movements. And these are movements, groups, and individuals, of course, that self-identify as Muslims, but don't necessarily adhere to Orthodox Islamic beliefs. So let me double check the actual methodology of the survey, but it's my understanding that if an individual self-identifies as Muslim, that's going to be taken at face value. The next question, although there are many white North Africans, there are also that I'm not really quite sure about how North African respondents might have responded to the survey question. I don't know. I would have to look at the methodology. So again, based upon ISPU's data, 28% of Muslims who responded to the survey identified as either African American or Black. Did that include darker skinned North Africans? I don't know. Because with darker skinned North Africans, they would have the option, really, they could identify as African, as Black, or they could identify as white. Again, that's why, in a certain sense, the labels don't really make a lot of sense. Again, this idea that white is a label that encompasses people from Europe, people of European descent, as well as people from various parts of North Africa and Southwest Asia. So based upon how the US government currently defines white, it is possible for someone with dark skin from North Africa to claim that category of whiteness. Whatever we think of that, it's still possible because of how these things are defined. All right. Let's see. I'd have to look at the methodology of that survey. Keep in mind that numbers, while the numbers might not be kind of like exact, I think it's a pretty good assessment of the American Muslim population. And when it comes to decline in African American mosques, I think that data is very reliable. Okay, so let's see. The next question, or the last question here, the percentage of African American mosques has decreased. No, so the actual number has gone down. And that's what's troubling. Like, African American mosques are closing. And the survey, or the study, the mosque study, basically defines a mosque as belonging to a particular ethnic group based upon, I think, 50% or higher of the mosque attendees being from that particular ethnic group. So those mosques are actually closing, and that is something that is troubling. Okay. All right. And I'm happy to, again, we're going to be posting some additional links in the chat. I'm happy to actually share the report. There's the full report, as well as a helpful summary of that report as well, that I think every concerned American Muslim should read. Is it possible to get a copy of the slides for review later? Inshallah. I mean, I don't see why that would, I think it should be, all right. It should be feasible to do that, but inshallah, I'll see. Did the sound go out again?
No, you're all set.
Okay, good. All right. Not sure why I'm getting these notifications from these AirPods. So inshallah, I'll see what I can do regarding the only issue that we might have with the slides is that originally this presentation was drafted by Dr. Amar for ING, and then shared with me as a speaker. Since ING has updated this presentation a number of times, and it's quite different today, I think I should be able to share it with you, inshallah. Again, so long as it's not being forwarded out. I think just for educational purposes, I think it's perfectly okay. So let's, again, pre-Columbian contact. So what I want to introduce you to is an idea that is quite, it's one that's really embraced by Muslims. It's embraced by Muslim scholars. It's embraced by some scholars outside of the Muslim community, scholars whose primary emphasis in their scholarship is centering the experiences of people of color, to be honest with you. So scholars that are more Africanist or Afrocentric in their approach, scholars that believe that the sort of the history of the Americas is not simply a history of European expansion, but also a history of Native American peoples, a history of peoples of African descent, including amongst them Muslims. So these are the, kind of overall, if you want to kind of have a sense of sort of what are the phases in American Muslim history. You can kind of look at them in terms of the pre-Columbian phase, then after that early Spanish presence in Muslims. That's why that piece in the Atlantic about Estebanico, he was from Azamur in Morocco, was so important. Then transatlantic slave trade, as you can see, between the 16th and 19th century. Then early immigration from the Levant. Then you have a couple cases of Anglo-American conversion to Islam. Then the proto-Islamic movement, so in the early 20th century, i.e. early 1900s, that's what that's referring to, kind of a rediscovery of Islam. And then the piece I started with, which is kind of where we are today. But I want to focus on pre-Columbian contact. It's an interesting theory, and keep in mind, scholars that are proponents of this theory are convinced that they have come across decisive evidence that establishes early Muslim presence in America before Christopher Columbus. As I said, the reason why conventional historical accounts do not present this information or do not really give this theory a lot of relevance is because you have to understand this. If an argument is made and accepted that Africans have the ability to navigate the Atlantic, to travel westward, to muster the men, material, and resources to reach the New World, that idea would completely upend the teaching of not just world history and not just American exceptionalism, but also, subhanAllah, I think the very idea of Western civilization itself would have to be, I think, questioned if an argument is made and accepted that African Muslims came to what becomes these United States and maybe parts of Central and South America before Christopher Columbus. It is a very powerful idea, and it's one that unfortunately does not really find wide acceptance outside of certain Muslim circles and Africanist scholars. So who was the main proponent? One of the earliest proponents of this idea was Ivan van Sertima, who was not a Muslim, but he was a scholar of early American and Mesoamerican, i.e. Central American history. And in the late 1970s or so, he wrote this book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America. And, I just want you all to kind of bear with me for a moment and think about the way that you might have, think about your high school history classes. Think about the way that you may have studied history or been taught history in college. Think about if you actually go into really most any institution of higher education today and kind of look at the required courses and electives, you're going to notice that you're probably going to take classes. They're going to offer classes in Western civilization. They might offer a survey in world history. And often what they will do with those classes is that there's a very kind of clear line of demarcation between sort of pre-modern and modern history. And that line of demarcation is actually drawn where? It's drawn in the year 1500. What happens in 1500, right? Well, what happens is that in 1492, so here we are, the end of the 15th century, in 1492, Christopher Columbus is going to sail west ostensibly to find a route to access the riches of the Far East in a way that he can circumvent the Muslim world and the Muslim middleman. So, the voyage itself, I think, is motivated in large part by what? The presence, power, and influence of Muslims in the 15th century and going into the 16th century. That's something that we cannot ignore. We tend to think of the Muslim world we tend to think of the Muslim history rather as sort of a history of, well, we have the prophetic era, which is of course the best of eras, hands down. And then we have like the golden age of Islam, which a lot of people say is the Abbasids, although it was probably more as the Medinan period of prophetic history. So, and then we kind of tend to think of Muslim history, I think many of us, in terms of decline after that. But when we look at that decline in terms of, well, the Muslim world kind of encounters the forces of modernity, and then it's basically a tale of decline after that. And what I want you all to understand is even when Europeans begin to sort of dominate the world stage, even when they acquire a certain amount of hegemony, that the hegemony of European imperialism is not inevitable. That that dominance is made possible by a confluence of factors. And one of the main factors is that Europeans are seeking routes that bypass the Muslim world because Muslims still possess a certain amount of influence and power. When it comes to regulating these routes, these land routes through the Muslim world to the Far East. By Far East, I'm referring basically to India and China. So that's why, like I said, when we study history in college, one of the ideas that's being presented to us is that when Columbus discovers, quote unquote, the New World in 1492, that this is going to usher in an age of exploration. This is where we can trace the roots of modernity, globalization, and that the scales of world domination are going to be tipped in favor of Europe. Well, what we can't separate from that and from Columbus's voyage is that Columbus himself is he's not just trying to bypass kind of Muslim influence in the Middle East and Near East, but Columbus himself is also kind of coming out of a European context that is shaped by what? It is shaped by the encounter between Islam and Christendom. So my contention, my dear brothers, my dear sisters, is that we really cannot tell the story of the founding or discovery, quote unquote, of the New World and the founding of the Americas without considering the role of Islam and the role of Muslims. That Muslims loom very large in the imagination and the motivation of those Europeans who are sailing westward. And the evidence for that is actually in Columbus's own journals, by the way. But remember, this is actually pre-Columbus. But in order to understand the significance of pre-Columbus, right, pre-Columbian contact, we have to know a little bit about Christopher Columbus himself. So the theory that is going to be proposed by Professor Van Sertima in the 1970s is that he believed, and other scholars as well shared that belief, that there was evidence we could find amongst Native American populations in North America, as well as evidence that scholars have encountered in Mesoamerica, i.e. Central America, and even South America to a degree, that point to possible African origins and influence. And it's a fascinating theory. And the theory is that Africans before Europeans had, like I said, the men, the kind of the material and the resources to actually navigate westward. And this map, so again, I'm not an expert on this particular kind of subject matter of ocean currents, but scholars that have looked at this have said, look, that Africans that lived on the western coast of Africa had knowledge of ocean currents to be able to actually plot a course westward to reach the Americas. And the argument that they make is that, again, the resources are there, the technology is there, and the interest. Because keep in mind that a civilization can have the resources, right? They can have the people, but if they don't have the interest, that kind of impulse for exploration, if they're kind of content to kind of be focused inwardly, then they're not going to send people out to explore. That's an argument that people have put forth about, for example, Chinese civilization at that time. Although there are theories about Chinese explorers as well. There are theories about Vikings. So several theories abound in terms of who discovered the New World. But the one this theory of pre-Columbian contact promoted by Van Sertima and others to me is interesting because this ties us back to Islam. So what they're going to argue is that it was Muslims at this time, West African Muslims, under the famed ruler. Right here we have the African Muslim king Abu Bakr II. But also we're going to add Mansa Musa of Mali to this as well. But there's a theory that what is present day Mali at that time is home to a very wealthy kingdom that is ruled by practicing Muslims that have interest in exploration. And what's interesting here, of course, in this particular presentation, we read about King Abu Bakr II in the early 1500s. But I also have in my notes here that the efforts of Mansa Musa are significant as well. Yes, absolutely. So here we are. It was his younger brother, the famous King Mansa Musa, who reported to an Arab historian the following story about his brother, King Abu Bakr II, and these fleets that he sent out. And the idea was that Africans, that his brother, so Mansa Musa's brother, had this idea that Africans should cross the Atlantic. At least people from the Kingdom of Mali should cross the Atlantic. And he sent out large fleets of ships. So again, you have a report from a very reliable source, Mansa Musa, reporting that his brother, King Abu Bakr II, is sending out fleets. Now, we don't know what was the fate of those fleets. That is a question that only Allah Ta'ala knows the answer in terms of where they actually landed, with whom they interacted. But my contention is that even though kind of traditional historians don't really pay a lot of attention to this, my contention is that it's possible. And the reason it's possible is because we know that Mali existed, number one. We know that King Abu Bakr II and Mansa Musa certainly existed. We know they were fabulously wealthy, and we know that it's possible that they had the navigational technology to send these fleets to the west. What's really interesting to me is that if you look at Mansa Musa himself, I mean, again, for people that kind of dismiss this as sort of this must, as some kind of fantastical notion, no, Mansa Musa and is so wealthy that when and there are accounts of this, by the way, that when he decides to go on Hajj, I think his route takes him through Egypt, for example, that he actually sends the Egyptian economy into inflation because of the amount of gold he's handing out. So, it's really, again, it's fascinating. Again, the reason why there's a certain amount of kind of skepticism about these accounts is because the account of a fabulously wealthy African king sending men to explore the West is something that I think for people that I think, whether we have consciously or unconsciously indoctrinated into white supremacy, it's a very difficult idea to grasp because it completely undermines these stereotypes of Africa as being, primitive and civilized, and all these sort of labels and stereotypes that have typically been imposed on Africa and African history. So where did the fleets land? Potentially somewhere in the area of Mesoamerica, right? Basically Mexico and Central American and possibly parts of South America. So for historians that are looking at this evidence, they're looking at a few different things. They're looking at carvings. So the physical evidence is pretty important. So they're interested in carvings, statuary, and other inscriptions. And they're looking at, basically sort of these figurines that have been excavated in the Americas, where they are, again, scholars who hold this theory are saying, hey, look, these are figurines that while we're unearthing these in the Americas, that these figures bear, features that are identified with West Africans, as well as what they are calling potential West African tribal markings. All right, so this is the evidence that you're going to see in books like They Came Before Columbus. And like I said, I think the theory is quite intriguing. Now, there is a counterpoint. And the counterpoint is that know that these are figurines that are produced entirely by indigenous, i.e., Native American artists that have no bearing on West African cultures. But again, I don't know if there's any kind of hard and fast answer against this theory. All right. Now, another thing too is the linguistic aspect of this, and I think there's a question about this from brother, I don't know if it's Kareem, brother or sister, but from Kareem Abdul Mateen. Would this contact explain? Yeah. So, and that's the thing. When you also have Native American groups, for example, that appear to have loan words that are influenced by Arabic, when you have Native American groups, as you were saying, who sign treaties using Muslim names, when you have attire that's being embraced by Native Americans that seems to have some clear Muslim influence, when you have place names in the Americas where there's Arabic influence, now it becomes a really intriguing question of perhaps maybe these African Muslims did reach these shores and have peaceful, fairly extensive and, of course, peaceful interaction with Native American populations. But like I said, there is discomfort with this theory because this theory would completely upend conventional narratives of Western civilization. Okay? Well, see, that's the thing. We just, again, in terms of where the voyages, here's another question. In terms of where the voyages ended up, we really don't know. The evidence is sort of, what almost sort of kind of forensic kind of evidence that they are kind of uncovering in the remnants of these Central American civilizations, i.e. carvings, relics, statuary, and so on. All right. Language, some words and loan words to an extent, but not so much kind of like religious practices. Although I do want to say this, Columbus himself, like I said, while this theory is not widely accepted, everybody agrees that Christopher Columbus came here in 1492. Everybody agrees that he landed somewhere in the region of Hispaniola, which is basically the region of Haiti and Cuba. Um, Everybody agrees he interacted with native populations. And let me mention this very interesting anecdote. Columbus writes, he keeps journals, and I'm glad that he did, because Columbus himself is going to document his voyages, the interactions he has, what he observes, and time again, when Columbus reaches for an analogy, for a frame of reference to describe the people with whom he's interacting, what is his analogy? Moors. Time and time again, he compares the indigenous American population to the Moors. And the Moors was basically the general term that Europeans used to describe Muslims, to describe and especially Muslims of African, North African, and to a degree Arab descent. That was the term they used, Moors. And that's so interesting that was his immediate frame of reference when he interacts with the native peoples. And, in terms of describing dress and even some customs, by the way, he starts talking about the Moors. Also, keep this in mind, 1492. I don't really believe in happenstance when it comes to history. In 1492, what's happening? Christopher Columbus, right, is receiving funding from none other than who, right? Queen Isabella in Spain, or Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, so who's going to lead the Catholic reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula? It's Ferdinand and Isabella. All right, they are the ones that preside over the fall of Muslim Spain. And my argument is that this voyage westward would not have been possible without bringing that last Muslim empire to its knees. All right, that's what happens. The last remaining Muslim dynasty in Spain at that time is the Nasrid dynasty, Nasrid, the Nasrids. And it is the Nasrid prince, Muhammad, I think it was Muhammad the second, I believe, but it quote me, but he was a prince, and he is the one that has to basically hand Granada over to the Spaniards with Alhambra. It's a very famous story. Ferdinand and Isabella, by the way, when they come to accept the Muslim defeat, what do? They dress up in Moorish garb. I think probably one of the ultimate acts of historical trolling. And it is Isabella that underwrites Columbus's voyage westward, which, by the way, is made possible because Columbus also brings Muslim Moorish navigators with him as well on that journey. So in terms of what's actually documented, this is now where I want to look at Muslims and before we look at transatlantic, Muslims and Spanish, the kind of the Spanish. So this early Spanish presence in Muslims. And this is where we're going to switch, inshallah, to this piece in the Atlantic, which is why I wanted you all to read this. Let me see, about Estebanico, very interesting person. This piece right here, Black America's Neglected Origin Stories. And this is where the author writes about growing up in Texas and learning about the Alamo and this idea of American exceptionalism. But she did not really learn a lot about early explorers of African descent. And this is where she's kind of reaching back into her memories and saying, wait a minute, that there was kind of some sporadic mention here and there of a man of African descent, a quote unquote Negro named Estebanico, who traveled through what would become Texas. And he was described, as you can see here, as a Black Arab from Azamor. And Azamor, is actually a location on the coast of Morocco. He was forced to convert to Christianity, sold away from his home to Spain, and eventually makes his way to Texas in the company of these kind of Spanish explorers and conquistadors. So, in terms of why this is significant, let's actually kind of think about that for a moment. It is his experience that tells us, I think, a few things about this encounter between the New World and the Old World, because Estebanico is definitely one of the earliest Muslims to come to to what becomes the United States. It's not the US at that time. But remember, he's not here on his terms. His religion is taken from him. He's forced to, to kind of like travel under the authority of these Spaniards. But even within, and understand this, he's a sympathetic figure in the sense that he's a man that's taken out of his world. Everything that is familiar to him, comforting to him, is taken away from him. He has to convert to Christianity, which is an experience that a lot of early Muslims have coming to these shores. But at the same time, the Spaniards end up relying on him. So even within those constraints, that this man has enough kind of intelligence, kind of fortitude and ingenuity, that he quickly picks up the languages of the native populations. And this man of color, who comes from African and Arab background, right? This Negro, or Moor, as they call him, actually becomes a spokesman for the Spaniards as they are exploring their newly acquired territories in the New World. It's an amazing story. And that encounter really encapsulates this idea of, what is meant by the Atlantic world. Just give me 1 second here. There's a book. I've got a number of books here that I can recommend. But the book that we actually study at Tafsir Seminary, where I teach my semester-long class on Islam in America. Again, what we're doing here in a couple hours is normally what I kind of do over 14, 15 weeks. So there is, this is, in my view, this is the best history of Islam in America in terms of the level of detail and kind of comprehensiveness. And the reason why I assign this book to my students is because, it's subtitled From the New World to the New World Order. This is a book that really kind of attempts to integrate the experiences, the history of Islam in America, with sort of that larger overarching framework and narrative of Atlantic world history. And it's an interesting approach. I think it's one that I think is quite strategic and beneficial, because what the author is seeking to do, he's seeking to kind of, he wants us to be able to sort of look at the history of Islam in America through a wider lens, as opposed to understanding the history of Islam in this country through unique and interesting individuals, which of course has merit. He wants us to understand something about larger global and historical processes. So of course, now as a teacher of history, I still have to break things down. So that's why we will still discuss individuals like Estebanico, for example. But understand that, Estebanico is not just an isolated figure, but instead he represents this idea of a world that's being produced by the various rivalries and encounters, right? Rivalries between the Spaniards, for example, and and the English. How the Europeans are going to vie for power on the global stage, and ultimately we're going to once the era of the Spaniards passes away, then we have the ascendance of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and what that means for Islam in America. And what the author is noting here is that Muslim presence in the United States, it's a story of the Atlantic world. It predates the founding of the United States. That the Atlantic world is a world that literally is created in those interactions between Muslims and Christians and Jews and Native Americans and people of African descent, people of European descent, people who find themselves, as the author says, deeply embedded in the commercial and political rivalries that led to the establishment of the Atlantic world. Again, commercial and political rivalries. Christopher Columbus is not, sailing westward because he has some great kind of curiosity just to see what's out there. I mean, that obviously that has to be part of it, but there are very kind of, as I mentioned, very kind of pragmatic considerations in terms of he needs to bypass the Muslim world so that he can access the riches of the East. And as the author notes, it is easy to forget that during this 15th and 16th centuries, i.e., this is when Columbus is active and the other explorers after him, European empires navigated the Atlantic in order to establish new trade routes that would circumvent the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern trade that's dominated by who? By the Muslims, right? Even the Portuguese, by the way, think about this. When the Portuguese, when they round the Cape, when they circumnavigate the Cape of Good Hope, the Portuguese are, often credited with, sort of being some of the earliest global explorers. We know they play a very harmful and formative role in the slave trade. But I want you to understand this. You know, when the Portuguese circumnavigate the Cape of Good Hope and they find themselves kind of traveling all up and down the coast of East Africa, what they're reckoning with, they are reckoning with the power and the influence of Muslims. That's why the Portuguese actually set their sights militarily and start attacking these Muslim coastal cities and states, because they understand the power and the influence of the Muslims, who up until the 16th century or so on were the dominant force in the hemisphere, in the world, the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. You know, for kind of a glimpse into that, look at Ibn Battuta's Rihla, right? Ibn Battuta is the famous North African traveler who in the 13th, 14th century is, travels all over the world, spends 30 years traveling. If you actually kind of see where Ibn Battuta tends to spend most of his time, it's actually in the Southern Hemisphere, where he, as a North African, feels entirely at home in the Muslim populated lands and worlds of the Indian Ocean. It's really amazing. Again, the Portuguese know that in order to become dominant there, they have to take on the Muslims militarily. So, like I said, you cannot separate, obviously, Islam and Muslims from what's happening on the global stage at this time. Another thing that our author says about this, as Europeans conquer and colonize the Americas, an Atlantic world emerges, a world that's going to connect Africa, Europe, and the Americas through a triangle of mercantile relations and imperial networks. Muslims from North and West Africa were active participants in this triangle, and many of them ended up in America as slaves. And Estebanico is one of those people. Again, the Spaniards rely on him. He learns native languages. He becomes their interpreter. Ultimately, it's a sad story, right? Estebanico ends up, he has encountered some Native Americans where he ends up being killed, sadly, but he was someone that obviously had skills that were well sought after by the Spaniards. Okay? Questions, comments? I know there's a lot of information I've presented. Let me check the chat. Bismillah. So there is, let's see here. There is a comment in the chat. I think the open questions, I've already answered them. And the comment here is, one of the conventional historical narratives of the post-Iberian Reconquista is that Columbus, his fleets were manned by felons. But in the late 15th century, many of these felons would have been Moors, many of whom would have had maritime knowledge. No, they weren't, they weren't felons. They were people that were being othered, right? They had been othered and cast outsiders because of their African, Arab, and Muslim heritage, but no, they weren't felons. All right. And see, again, this is why it's so important to study history through this perspective, because this, the Eurocentric narrative that so many of us have kind of become so sort of kind of indoctrinated with is a narrative that is going to ascribe everything sort of good and positive and advanced civilizationally to Europeans, and that it's a narrative that's also going to sort of marginalize and really seek to other, to kind of cast as entirely other Muslims, Arabs, and Africans. And one important point here, I want to also say that in this narrative, there is a silence, and that silence is the Native American voice. And I want to acknowledge that. So keep in mind that this theory that Muslims perhaps reached the Americas ahead of Columbus, while a very interesting and engaging one, is not one that would necessarily always be received positively by people that are of actual Native American heritage. So I want you to understand that perspective, right? Their view is that they lived here for millennia and did not have to necessarily be discovered by Europeans like Columbus, or even by Africans, from Mali, or Muslims, right? So I want you to also understand that point of view. Now, there are theories in terms of what are the origins, the kind of genetic origins of Native Americans. Could they possibly have migrated to the New World, subhanAllah, I guess millennia ago, when you had across the Bering Strait that might have linked Asia to North America, when you had one supercontinent? Allahu A'lam, that's beyond the scope of this course. But I want you to keep in mind that from the perspective of Native Americans, they would argue that they had the ability to kind of forge their own sort of culture, and that they had an identity that was unique and that stood kind of apart from Europeans and potential explorers from the Muslim world, right? But nonetheless, I think it still opens up interesting questions. And it opens this question, like I said, there's this question of European hegemony. Was it inevitable? And I don't think it was inevitable. I think that the European quote unquote discovery, because you can't really discover a world where there are already people there. But I think, this idea of they kind of discover the new world and they usher in modernity. We really have to complicate that. What happens is that they experience a pretty beneficial and fortuitous confluence of circumstances. You have the fall of Muslim Spain. You have the fact that Europeans now have access to the incredible wealth and riches of the New World. They literally thought this is where they were going to find El Dorado. I mean, this is where they thought they were going to find immortality, all right? When the Europeans arrive to these shores, by the way, one of the first things they do is they attempt to force the Native Americans into servitude. And according to, and it's, I mean, again, it's a brutal history. And this is the piece, this is the part of Western civ classes, right? That, this is what we're not learning, that this is not some romantic, grand tale of European kind of like swashbucklers and explorers. No, this is a history of conquest, of avarice, of greed, of oppression, of colonialism. What happens is that within about a half century of the arrival of Europeans to these shores, they managed to decimate about 75 to 80% of the native population. That is utterly appalling. And I have to say, my dear brothers, my dear sisters, that whenever I give a talk on Islam and Muslims, and then you get someone in the audience, oh, Muslims and Islam spread by the sword, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, there's nothing. There is, for the vast majority of Islamic history, even some unfortunate latter episodes you get in the waning days of the Ottoman Empire, there is nothing, right, in the sort of annals of Islamic history that would come close to what happens when the Spaniards come here. And again, about 80% of the native population is decimated within half a century. I mean, it's utterly appalling. For people who are, inshallah, I'll try to, and inshallah, I'll share the link if I can today or definitely by next week. But there's a podcast. This is the Throughline podcast with NPR. You've got to listen to the episode on the Spanish conquistadors. Wallah al-Azim. These guys today, they would be hauled up as war criminals. That's how bad the atrocities they committed when they came to these shores, the atrocities they committed against the Native Americans and these indigenous empires, the Maya and the Aztecs and so on. The podcast, it left me utterly speechless. By the way, they are doing this in the name of Christianity. I mean, and that's another thing too. There are overt religious overtones. Like I said, you cannot separate Islam and Muslims from the European imaginary when they come to the United States, to what becomes the United States, and and parts of Central and South America. So, for example, when you have the Spanish conquistadors, kind of arriving on to these shores and interacting with these indigenous populations in what becomes Central and South America. Literally, you have the Spaniards standing there on the beachheads, holding up the crucifix, reading the proclamation, from the king or so on, basically compelling the native populations to either convert to Christianity, to Catholicism, or to die by the sword. I mean, that's literally what's happening. By the way, the Spaniards that are coming here to the Americas, engaging with the Native Americans, they are fresh off of expelling Muslims and Jews from Spain. So some of them are coming in, and literally the titles that these guys have, the honorifics that they are bearing, names like Matamoros, that means killer of Moors. All right, killer of Muslims and Arabs. I mean, that's what's happening. So the Native Americans are not, again, they're the most immediate foil for this Spanish conquistadors is the fact that they have expelled the Muslims from Spain. Okay, so the Atlantic world. Let's talk about a little bit more about that. So in a moment. So, but let me see if there are any questions or comments, because I know that's a lot of information I presented, but I kind of want to go to the next part of this where I want to actually introduce sort of what happens in that and kind of after the conquistadors, what happens when they're not able to kind of, force the native population into servitude. What happens next, and why do they turn their attention to Africa? Questions, comments? Just let me know. Okay. All right. So inshallah, we need to kind of begin to wrap up here. SubhanAllah, there's so much that I want to present. Let me go ahead and share my screen again. And what we are going to look at here is, so here we are. So this is obviously post-Columbus, and this is where we really have, what becomes sort of like the origins of first mercantile and then sort of industrial capitalism. And that is with the Atlantic slave trade. And when it is, when the Native American population is decimated, that's when attention is now turned to Africa. And I want you to understand something about the Atlantic slave trade, that prior to the Atlantic slave trade, there was an ongoing trans-Saharan slave trade that had been taking place for centuries before the Atlantic slave trade. And this is where people were trafficked largely in exchange for what? For gold, for salt and other commodities. So, I want to, it really is impossible, frankly, to study, world history without studying slavery in all of its forms. Excuse me. But what I will argue is that there's something, kind of unique that we're going to see in that kind of obtains in the Atlantic slave trade. There's a reason why, American slavery is going to be called the peculiar institution. And that's because prior to the Atlantic slave trade, that, the status of enslavement was not necessarily tied to ethnic background or what we later on are going to call someone's kind of racial background and so on. I want you to understand that. And then what we also have to understand, again, I'm really kind of summarizing this will require multiple lectures, is that while you do have slave trade and a process of enslavement that certainly is kind of internal to Africa, that sort of the practices associated with enslavement in Africa are really vastly different from what we're going to see in the American context. And please understand, I'm not endorsing or condoning slavery at all. I'm not saying that it's okay and that somehow there's a more kind of humane slavery which we should be okay with, and then one that's not so humane. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there are features there are features of the experience of enslavement in Africa that are very different from what we're going to see in the American context. For example, enslavement is going to happen in the context of battles, right? Of conflicts. Maybe where one group, one polity is going to maybe kind of raid another. So kind of in the context of military activities and various raids, you might get people that are kind of taken away, they're captives, and now they become quote unquote slaves in that kind of new, in that new setting. And what's happening, again, this is not based upon race, right? This is not based upon physiognomy. This is not based upon skin color, that this is often a consequence of what are kind of like political and military activities, and that these people that are enslaved in this context, in many cases, are going to become part of that new tribal structure, part of that new system. They are going to become members, of that, fairly well-functioning members of that community. So there are features that are quite different, and these are not features of Atlantic slavery, which are what really make this experience unique, because in the context of the Atlantic, now we're going to see the mass importation and trafficking of human beings to do what? To basically fuel what are the foundations of this of a mercantile capitalist system. That is very, very different from what's happening in Africa. Again, not condoning the fact that Africans themselves are embroiled in the slave trade. Arabs are, Muslims are. We need to understand this, right? That I remember Dr. Jackson and others speaking about this, that there's a sort of communication coming from African scholars saying to their counterparts amongst Arab scholars that you've got to stop enslaving your fellow Muslim. You can't do this. And understand that, in a larger sense, if you kind of look at Islamic legal texts, there are different views of sort of enslavement status and what to do with, what happens, for example, if you have the al-Walad, the woman that gives birth to the child of the person that's enslaved her. I mean, these are categories and discussions you see in Islamic legal texts. You can't get away from those, right? You had some opinions regarding the permissibility of sort of non-Muslim slaves over Muslim slaves, et cetera, et cetera. This is beyond the scope of this class. Again, I'm not condoning any of this, but what I'm trying to argue here is that something happens in this American context that is very, very different. Also, the idea of kind of like a pan-African identity is something that is really not something that obtains during that time. I want you to understand that, if we can, as much as possible, try to kind of put ourselves in the shoes of people who lived centuries ago. Did Africans who were embroiled in the slave trade understand the consequences of their actions? Probably not. Do they understand that they're, these rivals or enemies or captives that they were selling to the Europeans, what was going to become of them, right? That when the enslaved persons got to that point of no return, these are places that you can find on the in Ghana and I think Senegal and other places off the coast of Africa. Literally, these are like these ports where people are herded into these buildings, these prisons, and subjected to all kinds of indignities, stripped of their clothing and everything in their identity, and they're forced into the holdings of these slave ships, and they're treated as a human cargo, and they are sent to the New World. That the people that were caught up in this, in terms of the actual kind of people that Africans and Arabs, did they really understand the implications of what they were doing? Allahu alam. It's very hard. It's very hard to say. But what we do know is that for the people that endured this process, for the people that experienced this, that when they are brought across the ocean to the New World, and this is what I want you all to understand, for that number of human beings to make that journey, the fact that the ones that survived that are able to really kind of exist in this context in the New World and retain kind of any semblance of agency is incredibly remarkable. And that's really where we can trace the roots of Islam in America. It is to those enslaved persons. And I don't like to say slaves. I know Nicole Hannah-Jones in her piece, The 1619 Project, actually argues, I think, against that. We need to be careful about the terminology that we use, because when you call people slaves, what you are doing is that you are kind of accepting there's a category of human beings for whom slavery is a natural disposition. No, these were people that were abducted, they were kind of bought and sold. They were imprisoned against their will. They endured what was called a process of seasoning, which is a brutal process where that person is an effort is kind of made by that person trafficking them to kind of psychologically break them, to make them more sort of susceptible to what's going to come next. A lot of that process actually begins, it actually kind of takes place in those locations on the coast of West Africa before they actually are put onto those ships. A lot of people, by the way, do not make it. There are revolts, there are uprisings. Many people simply, many people are going to actually throw themselves overboard. I mean, it's a tragic and brutal history. They are going to throw themselves overboard rather than be subjected to the atrocities that take place on these ships and what kind of awaits them at the other end. So I want you to understand something about the Atlantic slave trade in terms of just the human toll and impact of this. For a lot of, I think for time we need to wrap up, inshallah. For a lot of us as modern day people, I think we have a lot of sensitivity towards subjects concerning, genocide and Holocaust and other things that we learn about. But we need to understand that there were so many lives that were lost, and only Allah Ta'ala knows who those souls were that were lost in that process, and that organized kind of crime of bringing people across these shores. For those who want to learn more, there is a book by Ira Berlin called Many Thousands Gone, where he tries to come up with an estimate of how many people were abducted, from the coast of Africa, many of whom actually came from the interior of Africa, and put on these ships and brought across these shores. So, and by the way, these are our forebears. And I want us to understand that for scholars that examine the history of Islam in America, when they actually look at, okay, let's look at West Africa in, for example, the 17th century, let's look at the kingdoms that existed, let's look at the different kind of ethnic groups, let's look at in the different kind of political powers and rivalries, let's look at the religions they were practicing, that a lot of this activity of capturing and enslaving people is going to actually take place from sort of Muslim majority areas of West Africa. So the estimates vary, but the estimates, the one that, let me see if I have an estimate in front of me. I've heard what I have, so 10 to 40%. So the estimates do vary. Some people say perhaps 10 to 15%, and some scholars say as many as 35 to 40% of all Africans brought to the Americas were Muslims. Again, the way that they arrive at this conclusion is by looking at the picture of Islam in West Africa at that time. So inshallah, now I'm not going to present any of the fascinating biographies of these enslaved Muslims, but I do want to, and just kind of by way of introduction, kind of share this, this picture with you right here. Let me see this image. Yes, so here we are. Oops. So this is just a map, kind of giving you an overview of the Atlantic slave trade, spanning a couple centuries here. All right. And again, this is why the 1619 project is so important, because what Nicole Hannah Jones is doing is she's looking at the very earliest Africans that arrived to these shores. Again, what is this? Basically a century and a half before this nation is founded or so. And what I want you to understand is, the vast majority, I mean, look at these numbers. These numbers are staggering. And by the way, the people that are running these slave ships, whether it's the Portuguese, the British, and others, are they keeping track, right? Are they documenting their cargo? Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And sometimes they will actually destroy their quote unquote cargo to collect the insurance. I mean, it's absolutely appalling, but you can see where they are trafficking people from. And these are coastal areas where often Muslims are going to predominate, or linking back to interior areas where you have Muslim populations. You can see the routes they follow, and you can see that the vast majority of people are actually being trafficked to South America and Central America. And there are really fascinating studies of Muslim descended communities in South America and Central America. The Maroons, for example, in the West Indies, they actually try to live outside of British colonial authority, for example, and they have their own communities. They have Muslim origins. Then you've got in South America and Brazil in particular, which has a very, rich history of African influence. Brazil is a place that was home to slave uprisings, in many cases led by Muslims. So there's a very rich history here. And then what happens is that, like I said, there's a process where so-called seasoning process that happens in the coastal areas in Africa before the people are put on these ships and they're brought here. And there's another process called seasoning, where again, efforts are made to further kind of break people physically and psychologically, to force them into slavery. But what I want you to understand is, while maybe physically people are forced into slavery, in terms of mentally and spiritually, this is where you just see incredible resolve and fortitude amongst our forebears, amongst the Muslims that were brought here. Another consequence, by the way, of the Atlantic slave trade that I want you to understand is that it sort of what's the best term for this? It's going to kind of flatten out. It's going to flatten out differences and distinctions amongst the Africans that are brought here. So where, for example, on the African continent proper, that there were distinctions of ethnic group. I don't really like the term tribe. Like, these are ethnic groups and communities and societies. And you have people that are people practicing Islam and versus people practicing kind of more kind of native African religions and so on, or more animist type religions, because Islam, of course, does become native to Africa. So I want you to understand that distinctions that are quite salient within the African context of the continent are distinctions that ultimately are going to be kind of flattened out, in the slave trade. Although enslaved Muslims will command a certain amount of attention and in some cases respect, because of their prowess in the Arabic language, because of the fact that they are literate and so on. All right, so this is probably a good place. Pamela's 8 o'clock, so this is a good place to probably stop. And what I'll be doing, just in the interest of time, the presentation is very lengthy. I'll just be highlighting certain sections of it. So inshallah ta'ala, when we come back next Sunday, I will be focusing in particular on Bilali Muhammad and Abdul Rahman Ibrahima and Omar ibn Said, if we have time, and inshallah ta'ala. I'll also be speaking about why we don't know as much about women that were enslaved. And then, so we'll look at Muslims during that antebellum period. We'll consider what happens to Islam in America for the 50 or 75 years or so between the end of slavery and Reconstruction and proto-Islamic movements we see in the early 20th century. And I think that'll basically wrap us up. But questions or comments before we go, just let me know, inshallah ta'ala. And again, please bear with me. I normally teach this over 14, 15 weeks, so I'm trying to do my best to summarize. And a great comment here from Amori. The doctrine of discovery was a set of papal bulls, yes, or edicts authorizing the Spanish crown, right? So there we have the imprimatur of the church, the stamp of the church on these activities, right? To conquer the new world. It was a direct reaction to the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. That Christian doctrine framed all manner of abuse and disenfranchisement as upon a Christian theological basis. Yes, absolutely did talk about religion being spread by the sword. What was the role of Muslims and Africans in selling? Well, to be honest with you, brother or sister Chowdhury, and thank you. I don't know, is it brother Amori? Please forgive me if I'm not using the correct title. Again, I can't see anyone, so please forgive me. It is. So here's the thing. This is what I teach my students at Taser Seminary. Just bear with me. I think that as Muslims, there's a certain degree of historical amnesia that's come to play in terms of our conversation around Islam and enslavement. And the reason I'm saying that is because within the American context, Islam is seen very undoubtedly and definitively as a liberating force, i.e., that it is by virtue of being Muslim that enslaved persons are able to transcend their circumstances to a degree that perhaps other enslaved individuals were not able to do, right? There's a certain distinction that they enjoy as Muslims. There's a connection that they have back to the Muslim world. But at the same time, what we have to understand is that Europeans are not exclusively the culprits in this process, right? As as tempting as it is to squarely place the blame on European slavers and imperialists, that their activities would not have been possible without, sadly, the collusion of Africans themselves, both Muslims and non-Muslim, as well as Arab Muslims. I mean, this is just an historical fact. The reason I'm saying that, that's why I brought up the trans-Saharan slave trade, because I want you to understand there's a slave trade that predated the Atlantic slave trade, by centuries. So yes, I mean, there is a role being played by Africans and by Arabs, whether they are middlemen, whether they are people, in some cases, perhaps in the African context, like this is a way of getting rid of your rival, for example. Unfortunately, there were mercenaries that were involved that were making money off of this process. And there is, unfortunately, a strong demand in the Muslim world for slaves. This is something that, like I said, there's a certain amount of historical amnesia amongst Muslims kind of concerning this, because this is one of the more difficult aspects of our history. But I think we have to grapple with it. We have to grapple with the fact that Islamic legal texts still have discussions of slavery. And of course, while we can argue that ultimately the intent was to scale back and emancipate or eradicate slavery, the fact of the matter remains is that the fact of the matter, what still remains is that slavery was, I don't think it was just sort of a tertiary feature. I think it was a pretty important feature of pre-modern Muslim societies. In fact, we know that there are some countries in the Muslim world that it took until the 1960s or even afterwards to actually outright ban slavery. Now, I will argue that that liberative impulse was always there in early Muslim history. In fact, when you look at who comes to the Prophet, peace be upon him, it's enslaved persons. So these are people who are being attracted to Islam. I mean, Sayyidina Bilal is able to, subhanAllah, to be Sayyidina Bilal and stand up against the prevailing powers in Mecca and the Quraysh because of his belief in the liberative potential of La ilaha illallah. So I want you all to understand that. But we also have to think about how Muslim societies are going to kind of end up kind of developing, kind of evolving. One of the things that Sheikh Hassan mentions here at the seminary where I teach is he said, look, we can't really examine early Muslim dynastic history without looking at slavery. And he mentions the Umayyads and how there were certain Umayyads that were so they were so kind of committed to or so kind of interested in kind of bringing in slaves, trafficking in the slave trade, that they end up changing the demographics he said, impacting the demographics of certain parts of the Muslim world, including North Africa, because they're importing all these human beings. So these are things that we have to think about and reckon with. All right. So I hope that helps a little bit to answer that question. Let's see. Okay, there's a question from Sister Afsha. I'm not sure if I understand this. Hopefully I answered this. So if you could elaborate, because I think I answered this in terms of Muslims owning slaves. We could have a conversation about why doesn't kind of like an organic movement in the Muslim world kind of arise to abolish slavery? Why does this kind of happen in the West? And that's kind of an interesting conversation. I can, inshallah, there's a professor, Dr. Bernard Freeman, who's a Muslim, by the way. There's a professor who's done some really good work on kind of like abolition movements in the Muslim world. So that's something that I can share, inshallah ta'ala. And he kind of looks at that question of why do we get, what are the circumstances that kind of obtain that we see these efforts to stamp out slavery largely being spearheaded by Protestant Christians as opposed to Muslims? It's a really interesting question. All right, so I can, inshallah ta'ala, make a note to share that. So before we wrap up, let me just go ahead and at least, inshallah, I will send to Brother Hussam at Al-Hidaya Center. I will go ahead and send the links that I refer to. So inshallah, just give me 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I send to him all those links that I refer to. Like I said, there are the required readings if you can get to them, but there are also supplemental resources that I want to share. So I'm going to just kind of post those in the chat. So in the chat, I posted both the required readings as well as the supplemental resources. And like I said, inshallah, we will make sure that we get these out in an additional email, along with that piece by Dr. Freeman. Okay. All right. Let's see. Bismillah. And again, back to Sister Afshan's question. there, just to kind of, if I might kind of try to tackle this in a very kind of, kind of generalizing, you have to understand that for some Muslims, they might have made the argument that, look, that we have embedded in Islamic law mechanisms to ameliorate people's circumstances. And that's why we don't have like an outright ban on slavery. But again, it's a very kind of complex situation. All right. Okay. And I think that covers all the resources that I'd listed. I think the last thing is the documentary 13th, which, like I said, is for mature audiences. Keep that in mind. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up. And looking forward to your reflections. I think, has the link been posted for the reflections?
So I posted it in the chat, and
Oh,
also I'm preparing an email now which has
okay.
that link as well as all of these links as well.
Okay,
And
Jazakallah khair.
this
Appreciate it.
recording will also be available to them to watch later on.
Okay, excellent. All right, so that means we can go ahead and inshallah, all the questions have now been answered. Okay, excellent. So if I overlooked anyone's question, please forgive me. And thank you so much for logging on. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant all of us acceptance and forgiveness, and to elevate our intentions, and to reward us for the best of our actions and forgive our shortcomings and misdeeds and sins. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us through this class and others to appreciate the sacrifices of our spiritual forebears and to be ambassadors of Islam, because it is truly my belief that Islam is in America today, not by happenstance, but because of the dua of these oppressed peoples who came here, right, many, many, many years ago. And like I said earlier, my dear brothers, my dear sisters, their circumstances were anything but ideal. They were not here on their own terms. For us, we have the privilege to be here largely on our own terms. So let's take advantage of that. Okay. So barakallahu fikum and jazakumullah khairah. And salamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. And inshallah, we'll meet again next week. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin wa sallallahu Muhammad. All right. Take care, everybody. And jazakumullah khairah to Al-Hidaya team. Sister Alina, how are you doing? Good to see you. Thank you, everybody. And we will meet next week, inshallah ta'ala. All right. Salamu alaikum.
Thank you so much.